The shards of a shattered crystal flute glisten like diamonds in the champagne soaking into the hem of Isolde's emerald silk gown. She stands in the dead center of the Nightmoor ballroom, one shoulder of her dress torn away, exposed to the cold air and the colder stares of 500 nobles. "I said, get out." Duke Valerian's voice isn't a shout, it is a serrated whisper that cuts through the music. He stares at the forged letter in his hand, his knuckles white with the strain of not striking her. "I will not have a traitor's mistress carrying a bastard under my roof." Isolde doesn't blink. She doesn't defend herself against the lie. She locks eyes with the Duke's mistress, who watches from the balcony with a small, poisonous smile, and turns her back on the only man she ever loved. She walks out of the gold-leafed palace and into the freezing rain, a fallen lady with a secret that could topple the Nightmoor line. 3 years later, the silk is gone. Isolde's hands are raw, stained with stable muck and scarred from winter frost. She heaves a heavy bale of hay, her breath hitching as she looks up at the castle. High above, on the balcony, Valerian's silhouette is a lonely shadow against the warmth of the palace lights. He is looking down at the stables, unaware that his destiny is breathing in the dirt beneath him. Isolde moves to the darkest corner of the stall. She pulls back a coarse wool blanket to reveal a shock of royal purple silk. Cradled in the straw is a 3-year-old boy. He opens his eyes, violet eyes, identical to the Duke's, and reaches up with a tiny hand that bears the silver-flecked birthmark of the Nightmoor bloodline. Suddenly, the heavy stable doors groan open. Light floods the hay. Valerian stands there, his cloak dripping, his face twisted in a look of absolute shock as he catches the glint of royal gold thread in the mud. Isolde stands, shielding the child with her body. She grabs a heavy iron pitchfork, the point aimed directly at the Duke's throat. "Step closer, Valerian," she whispers, "and I'll show you exactly what a banished woman does to protect a king." The Duke takes a step, his hand reaching out not for her, but for the boy who shouldn't exist. Outside, the sound of galloping horses approaches. The king's guard is coming to search the stables for a hidden traitor. Isolde has 3 seconds to choose: trust the man who broke her, or run into the night with the true heir. The heavy oak doors of the chapel didn't just close, they slammed, a sound like a guillotine blade echoing through the vaulted stone. Isolde stood on the rain-slicked steps of Nightmoor Cathedral, the hem of her exquisite lace wedding gown already drinking in the mud. She turned, her breath hitching, as Valerian stepped into the archway. He wasn't wearing the expression of a groom. He looked like an executioner. "Valerian, please," she whispered, her voice trembling against the sudden chill. "The letter is a forgery. I have never even met the Baron of Gwent." He didn't move to shield her from the downpour. Instead, he tossed a bundle of cream-colored parchment at her feet. "The ink matches your own vanity set, Isolde. The seal is yours, and the physician, he has confirmed your condition, began months before I returned from the front." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her. "You didn't want a husband. You wanted a golden shroud to hide your shame." From the window of the carriage waiting at the curb, a pale hand parted the silk curtains. Lady Alara, Valerian's devoted cousin, watched with a gaze as sharp as a funeral bell. She didn't say a word, but the slight curve of her painted lips was a victory march. Isolde saw it, the flicker of a trap snapping shut, but when she looked back at Valerian, his eyes were shuttered by a pride so thick no truth could pierce it. "You are stripped of the Nightmoor name," Valerian declared, his voice carrying to the gathering crowd of gossips and news sheets. "You will not return to your father's house to bring them further ignominy. You will live in the only place fitting for a creature of your low character." The social death was instantaneous. The Marquis of Vane turned his back. The Duchess of Kent shielded her daughter's eyes. Isolde felt the world tilting, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Where?" she gasped, clutching her stomach, the secret life within her kicking as if sensing the storm. "The stables," Valerian spat. "You shall sleep among the beasts until the child is born, then you will vanish." He turned his back, the heavy doors groaning shut once more, locking her out of the life she knew. Isolde stood alone in the deluge, her wedding veil heavy with filth. She looked toward the carriage, seeing Ilara's smirk widen before the curtains snapped shut. Isolde reached down, picking up the forged letters. Her fingers brushed her abdomen, and her stoicism finally hardened into something deadlier than grief. She wouldn't just survive, she would wait. But as the first carriage rolled away, splashing her with gutter water, a stable hand rushed toward her, his face pale with terror. "My lady, you must hide," he hissed, glancing toward the shadows of the cathedral. "The Duke thinks he has punished you, but Elara, she has hired men to ensure you, and the bastard never reached the stables alive." The shadows of the Nightmoor stables were no longer prison, they were a fortress. Isolde crouched in the golden dust of the hayloft, her fingers, once accustomed to silk, threading through the coarse mane of a restless stallion. Below, the thundering rhythm of hooves approached. It was the Duke's hunting party, a parade of arrogance returning from the forest. "Quiet, Cassiel," she whispered, pressing her palm against the chest of the 3-year-old boy hidden in the straw. The child's violet eyes, a haunting mirror of the man leading the charge outside, locked onto hers. As the riders swept past the open stable doors, a heavy spray of gutter mud erupted, coating Isolde's threadbare emerald skirts. She didn't flinch. She watched through the slats as Valerian rode at the front, his profile as cold and unyielding as the stone of the manor. Beside him, Lady Elara laughed, her gloved hand resting possessively on his sleeve. They looked like a king and queen, while the true heir of Nightmoor sat in the dirt, learning to breathe in silence. "Horse," Cassiel chirped, his first clear word breaking the heavy quiet. Isolde's heart leaped and shattered all at once. She pulled him close, the gold-threaded royal purple swaddling, the only relic of her former life, shimmering against the grey grime of their sanctuary. Survival was a game of invisible trades. Every midnight, Isolde met the head stableman, Sealers, in the shadows. She traded her remaining jewelry, piece by agonizing piece, for fresh milk and thick blankets. "The Duke is restless, my lady," Sealers muttered tonight, sliding a small loaf of bread toward her. "He spends his nights in the library, staring at your portrait. Elara is furious. She started asking questions about why the stable stores are disappearing." Isolde felt a chill sharper than the winter wind. She can ask all she likes, as long as she stays away from this wing. But the peace was a lie. Later that evening, the heavy stable doors groaned. Isolde scrambled to cover Cassiel, but the intruder wasn't Sealers. It was Valerian. He walked with a heavy, uncoordinated gait, a crystal decanter of brandy swinging from his hand. He looked broken, his cravat undone, his eyes searching the darkness for a ghost. He stopped just feet from their hiding spot, leaning his forehead against the wooden post of the stallion's stall. "Isolde," he choked out, the name a jagged plea. "Why do I see your face in every shadow?" Isolde held her breath, her hand over Cassiel's mouth. The boy shifted, his tiny boot kicking a bucket. The metal clanged, a deafening strike in the hollow space. Valerian froze. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he reached for a lantern. The light flared, spilling across the straw, creeping toward the purple silk. Just as the flame threatened to reveal the boy's face, a high, piercing scream erupted from the manor. "Valerian, help me!" It was Elara's voice, frantic and shrill. Valerian hesitated, his gaze lingering on the dark corner where Isolde huddled. He turned and sprinted toward the house, but as he left, a small, glinting object fell from his pocket into the hay. Isolde reached out and grabbed it. It was the Nightmoor signet ring, the very seal used to forge the letter that ruined her, and it was covered in fresh, wet blood. The scream from the manor was still echoing when the first tendril of orange light licked the hayloft floor. Isolde didn't move toward the door, she lunged for Cassiel. The stable wasn't just a prison anymore, it was a tinderbox. "Mama, hot," the boy whimpered, his tiny hands clutching the royal purple silk as the smell of burning cedar and horsebannock filled the air. Outside, the chaos was a symphony of terror. Above the roar of the flames, Isolde heard the heavy thud of the stable doors being kicked wide. She expected Sealers, the stableman, or perhaps a panicked groom. Instead, a silhouette cut through the thickening smoke, tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in a soot-stained greatcoat. Duke Valerian Nightmoor had entered the dark world he had created. "Isolde," his voice thundered, cracked with a desperation she hadn't heard in 3 years. He moved through the stinging haze, stepping over the burning signet ring he had dropped moments before. He wasn't looking for his horses. He was looking for the ghost he had been chasing through the brandy fumes. Isolde stood in the center of the stall, the iron pitchfork held steady even as the rafters groaned above them. "Stay back, Valerian. You banished me to the shadows. Do not dare step into them now." He stopped, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes, reflecting a mix of horror and agonizing relief. "The East Wing is ablaze. Ilara claims you set it, but I know." He trailed off, his gaze dropping from her face to the bundle hidden behind her skirts. The roof gave way. A beam wrapped in flame crashed between them, showering the dirt in sparks. The horse screamed, rearing up, and in the sudden, violent light, Cassiel stumbled forward, rubbing his stinging eyes. Valerian froze. The world seemed to stop even as the fire roared. He dropped his lantern, the glass shattering unnoticed. He didn't see the muck on Isolde's face or the rags of her dress. He saw the boy. He saw the silver-flecked birthmark on the child's temple. He saw the violet eyes, his eyes, blinking back at him with innocent curiosity. The bastard he had denounced was a living, breathing image of his own soul. "My God," Valerian whispered, his knees hitting the stable floor. He has the mark." "He has nothing of yours," Isolde snapped, her voice trembling with 3 years of stored fury. "He is the son of a stable hand and a forgotten woman. Leave us to the fire, Grace. It's cleaner than your mercy." Valerian reached out, his hands shaking, but before he could speak, a shadow blocked the doorway. It was the captain of the King's Guard, his sword drawn. "Your Grace," the captain shouted. The mistress pointed the way. "We have the arsonist and the evidence of the stolen treasury." He pointed his blade not at the fire, but at the purple silk swaddling the child. "The royal purple. Only a thief or a traitor would possess it. Move aside, Your Grace, while we arrest the woman who tried to burn your legacy to the ground." Valerian stood slowly, his face shifting from shock to a terrifying, cold rage. He didn't look at the captain. He looked at Isolde, then down at the signet ring near his boot, the seal covered in Ilara's wet blood. "Captain," Valerian said, his voice like grinding ice as he stepped in front of Isolde and the boy. "You are mistaken. This woman is not a thief. She is the Duchess of Nightmoor, and that boy is your future king. Arrest anyone who dares to suggest otherwise, starting with the woman who gave you that order." But as the captain hesitated, a second fire erupted, not from the wood, but from the manor's black powder stores. The explosion rocked the earth, and through the hole in the stable wall, Isolde saw Ilara standing in the courtyard, holding a torch toward the only exit. The smoke was a physical weight, pressing the breath from Isolde's lungs as the stable rafters groaned in a final, agonizing surrender. Valerian didn't hesitate. He lunged through the falling sparks, his soot-stained greatcoat flaring like a dragon's wings as he scooped Cassiel into one arm and seized Isolde's wrist with his free hand. "The exit is blocked by Ilara's men," Valerian roared over the crackle of the inferno. "We take the servants' tunnel, now." He dragged them into the damp, lightless stone passage that connected the stables to the manor's underbelly. As the heavy iron door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the heat, the silence of the tunnel felt deafening. Valerian slumped against the weeping stone wall, still clutching the boy to his chest. Cassiel didn't cry. He simply stared at the Duke with those hauntingly familiar violet eyes, his tiny hand reaching out to touch the silver stubble on Valerian's jaw. "Isolde," Valerian choked out, the name catching on a sob. "I have spent 1,000 nights rehearsing what I would say if I ever found you, but I never knew I had a son." "You had a wife once, too," Isolde snapped, her voice trembling as she snatched Cassiel from his arms. The boy whimpered at the sudden movement, clutching the royal purple silk tighter. "But you traded her for a forged letter and a mistress." Whisper, "Do not play the grieving father now, Grace. It is unseemly." Valerian stood straight, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic light. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant wretch, but Ilara is being dealt with. The guard is searching her rooms even now. Come to the castle. The West Wing is untouched. You will have doctors, silk, a bed that isn't made of straw. Cassiel deserves a throne, not a stall." Isolde laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the damp walls. "A throne? so he can be surrounded by the same vipers that tore his mother apart, so he can watch his father look at him and wonder if the blood is truly pure. She stepped closer, the muck on her face contrasting with the fierce nobility in her gaze. I would rather be a free stable hand shoveling filth, but sleeping with a clear conscience, than be a prisoner in your gold rooms again. We are leaving, Valerian. Valerian's hand shot out, not to grab her, but to block her path. He sank to one knee in the dirt of the tunnel, the movement so sudden it stole Isolde's breath. The Duke of Nightmoor, the most ruthless man in the peerage, was kneeling in the dark. "I am not asking you to be my wife," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am begging you to be his mother in a place where he is safe. If you won't come for me, come for the truth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, charred locket. "I found this in the ashes of your old rooms. It was never a letter from a lover, Isolde. It was your father's last confession." Isolde froze. Her father had died in silence, his secrets buried. As she reached for the locket, the tunnel door behind them shrieked open. It wasn't the guard. It was Lady Elara, her face half hidden by a cloak, a smoking pistol leveled directly at the child. "If I cannot have the Duke," Elara hissed, her eyes wild with madness, "then nobody will have his heir. What will Isolde sacrifice to save her son? And what secret lies within the charred locket?" The click of the pistol's hammer was the only sound in the damp tunnel, a sharp, lethal punctuation to Elara's madness. But before the trigger could be pulled, Valerian moved with the speed of a man possessed. He didn't reach for his own weapon. He threw his body in front of Isolde and the child, his broad back a wall of solid muscle and soot-stained velvet. "Kill me then," Valerian commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying calm. "But if a single hair on that boy's head is singed, I will ensure the gallows are the kindest mercy you receive." The distraction was enough. Silas, the head stableman, emerged from the shadows behind Elara, disarming her with a swift, brutal strike. As the guards dragged the screaming woman away, the tunnel fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Valerian turned, his face ghostly pale, and looked at the child who had nearly died because of his own blindness. "He needs to be seen," Valerian whispered, his eyes never leaving Cassiel. "Not by a stable hand, by the royal physician." 2 hours later, the west wing of Nightmoor Manor was bathed in the clinical, cold light of a dozen candelabras. Isolde stood by the hearth, her emerald dress now a rag, her hands trembling as she watched Sir Alastair, the king's own doctor, examine the sleeping boy. Valerian paced the perimeter of the room like a caged beast, his jaw tight. "Well," Valerian barked, unable to endure the silence. Sir Alastair stood, wiping his spectacles. He looked from the boy's silver-flecked temple to the Duke's identical features. "There is no need for a bloodletting to confirm what the eyes can see, Your Grace. The silver fleck is a rare genetic marker found only in the Nightmoor line. It is as distinct as a signature." He paused, his gaze turning to Isolde. "But more than that, the boy has the respiratory scarring of a child raised in damp, toxic conditions. He has survived a winter he should have never seen." The words hit Valerian harder than any blade. The evidence of blood was a double-edged sword. It proved the boy was his, and it proved he had nearly killed his own legacy through neglect. "I have the locket, Isolde," Valerian said, his voice a jagged ruin. He held out the charred piece of jewelry. "Your father didn't hide a lover. He was hiding the fact that he had discovered Elara's father was embezzling from the Nightmoor treasury years ago. Elara didn't just want me, she wanted the debt erased. She framed you to keep the secret buried." Isolde took the locket, her thumb brushing the soot. "And you believed her because it was easier than trusting the woman you claimed to love." Valerian stepped into her space, the scent of smoke and expensive brandy clinging to him. The romantic tension was a living thing, thick with 3 years of unspent longing. He reached for her hand, the calloused, scarred hand of a stable soul. "I will spend every breath making this right," he vowed, his face inches from hers. "Will you?" Isolde whispered, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "Because the king's guard didn't just come for me, Valerian. They came because the king has heard rumor of a hidden prince, and he considers any unacknowledged heir a threat to the throne." A heavy knock sounded at the door. It was the king's messenger, bearing a black wax seal. "Your Grace," the man announced, His Majesty demands the boy be brought to the tower for safekeeping until a formal trial of lineage can be held. Valerian's grip tightened on Isolde's hand. He had found his son, only to realize he had just handed him over to the king's executioner. Will Valerian defy the crown to keep his family, or has his redemption come too late to save the boy from the tower? The black wax seal of the king's messenger sat on the table like a death warrant, but the true threat wasn't the tower, it was the shadow moving toward the nursery wing. As Valerian turned to confront the messenger, a muffled cry echoed from the hall. Isolde didn't wait for the Duke's command. She lunged for the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached the nursery just as a pair of turncoat guards, bribed with the last of Ilara's stolen jewels, were prying open the window to the freezing night. Ilara stood between them, her face a twisted mask of desperation. She wasn't holding a pistol this time, she was holding a heavy damp cloth, saturated with a sweet-smelling tincture meant to silence the air forever. "If he breathes, I hang," Ilara hissed, her eyes wild as she lunged toward Cassiel's cradle. "But if he vanishes, you are just a madwoman in the mud again." Isolde didn't scream for Valerian. There was no time. She snatched a heavy iron pitchfork, the very one she had used to survive the stables, from where it leaned against the hearth. With a primal snarl, she drove the tines into the floorboards, an inch from the lead guard's boot. "Step away from my son," Isolde commanded, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, low-frequency power. The guard hesitated, unnerved by the sight of a highborn lady wielding a peasant's weapon with such lethal precision. "She's a stable wench, you fool, kill her," Ilara shrieked. The guard drew his sword, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. He swung, but Isolde parried with the wooden shaft, the impact vibrating up her arms. She used the length of the pitchfork to sweep his legs out from under him, her movements a blur of emerald silk and raw fury. Valerian burst into the room a second later, his sword already drawn, but he stopped dead. He saw Isolde standing over the fallen guard, the points of her pitchfork at his throat, while her other hand protected Cassiel's head. The Duke's eyes flashed with a mix of horror and a new, burning respect. This wasn't the fragile girl he'd banished. This was a lioness. "Sealers," Valerian roared, and the loyal stable hands flooded the room, pinning the traitors. Valerian strode to Ilara, his face a mask of cold stone. He didn't strike her. He simply took the damp cloth from her hand and pressed it to her own face until she slumped. "Take her to the stables," Valerian ordered, his voice echoing with a cruel irony. "Let her see if she can survive 3 years in the dark." He turned to Isolde, reaching out to take the pitchfork from her shaking hands. His touch was electric, a sudden spark of heat amidst the cold violence. "Isolde, you saved him. You saved our house." "I saved my son," she corrected, her breath hitching as the adrenaline faded. "But the king's messenger is still waiting, Valerian, and he saw everything." Valerian looked at the doorway. The messenger wasn't alone. Standing behind him was the Prime Minister, clutching a document that would change everything. "The king does not want a trial, Your Grace," the minister announced. "He wants an alliance. He has betrothed the hidden prince to the Princess of Wales to be taken into custody immediately for her protection." Isolde gripped the royal purple silk. To save her son from the stables, she had accidentally handed him to the crown as a political prisoner. Will Isolde agree to the betrothal to keep Cassiel alive, or will she flee into the night once more? The black wax seal of the king was still warm when Valerian snatched the Prime Minister's decree and shredded it into a dozen white feathers. "The king wants a puppet," Valerian roared, his voice shaking the crystal droplets of the nursery chandelier. But he forgot that a Nightmoor does not trade his flesh for favor. As the Prime Minister retreated in shock, Valerian turned to the ebony writing desk Ilara had used during her reign of the manor. With a primal growl, he drove his shoulder into the locked drawer, the wood splintering like bone. Inside lay a bundle of vellum, tied with a ribbon the color of dried blood. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the lines with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. "The letters," he whispered, the sound more haunting than a scream. These weren't just forgeries of Isolde's hand, they were a roadmap of his own destruction. He saw the practice strokes where Ilara had mimicked Isolde's distinctive G, the notes on which servants to bribe, and most devastatingly, a letter from the Baron of Gwent himself, begging Ilara to stop her extortionate demands. Isolde stood by the cradle, her fingers white-knuckled on the pitchfork she refused to drop. "You see it now, don't you? The monster wasn't in my bed, Valerian. It was at your dinner table. It was laughing with you while I was shivering in the hay." Valerian's rage was cataclysmic. He didn't just break the desk. He upended the massive mahogany piece, sending inkwells shattering against the silk wallpaper. He turned to the window, watching the carriage that held a sedated Ilara. "Bring her back," he bellowed to the guards in the courtyard. "She will not have the mercy of the stables. She will face the high court for treason against the heir." He spun back to Isolde, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot. The romantic tension snapped like a taut wire as he closed the distance between them. He didn't reach for her hand, he reached for her face, his thumbs brushing the dirt from her cheekbones with a tenderness that felt like a plea. "I threw away the sun for a shadow," he choked out, his forehead leaning against hers. "I am the villain of this story, Isolde, not her, me." Isolde felt the heat of his skin, the familiar scent of sandalwood, and regret making her dizzy. She wanted to strike him, she wanted to kiss him until the last 3 years vanished. "Your guilt is a heavy crown, Valerian, but it won't keep Cassiel safe from the king's men." Valerian's eyes sharpened, the cataclysmic rage hardening into a cold, lethal resolve. He pulled a hidden lever behind the hearth, revealing a safe that held the Nightmoor wartime reserves, pure gold bullion, and the legendary Star of the North diamond. "We aren't going to the tower," Valerian declared, his voice a jagged promise, "and we aren't staying here. If the king wants a prince, he will have to find us in the one place even his spies fear to tread." He looked at Isolde, a dangerous glint in his eye. "We are heading to the Scottish Highlands tonight, but Isolde," the locket had one more secret. He opened the charred casing, revealing a second compartment. Inside wasn't a confession. It was a wedding ring, not the one he'd given her, but her mother's long-lost band, engraved with a name that wasn't Marowin. "Your father didn't just discover Ilara's theft," Valerian whispered. "He discovered you aren't a Marowin at all. You are the lost princess of the French Regency." "Isolde is not just a duchess, she is a sovereign. Will this revelation save them from the king, or make them the ultimate target for execution?" The locket's secret hung in the freezing air like a ghost. Isolde stared at the mother-of-pearl band, the realization that she was the lost princess of the French Regency making the world tilt. But before she could speak, the heavy thud of marching boots vibrated through the tunnel floor. The king's guard hadn't left. They were returning with reinforcements to seize the traitorous child. "They are coming, Isolde," Valerian said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, urgent rasp. "And they won't care about your bloodline until you are behind bars. We must go." He didn't wait. He grabbed a heavy traveling cloak, throwing it over her scarred emerald dress, and ushered them out of the manor's secret service entrance. But instead of a carriage waiting at the gate, they were met by a wall of red-coated soldiers. The Prime Minister stood at the front, his face a mask of bureaucratic cruelty. "By order of the Crown, the boy is to be taken. Move aside, Nightmoor." Isolde felt Cassiel tremble against her neck. She looked at the mud beneath her feet, the same muck she had lived in for 3 years, and then at the man who had put her there. Valerian didn't draw his sword. Instead, he did something that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the soldiers. The most ruthless duke in England sank to his knees. He didn't kneel on a silk cushion or a marble floor. He sank into the cold, grey stable mud, the filth soaking into his bespoke buckskins. He looked up at Isolde, his eyes wet with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "I do not ask you to return as my wife," Valerian declared, his voice carrying with a resonant power that silenced the Prime Minister. "I do not ask you to forgive the monster I was. I ask you to return as the sovereign of this house. My titles, my lands, my very breath are yours to command. If the king wants this boy, he must take him from the hands of the woman who owns Nightmoor Manor." The romantic tension was suffocating. In the flickering torchlight, Valerian reached out, his hand hovering inches from Isolde's muddy hem. The soldiers wavered. They had come to arrest a stable wench, but they were witnessing a coronation of the heart. "Valerian, get up," Isolde whispered, her pride warring with the heat rising in her chest. "Not until you realize that you were never the prisoner," he countered, a sad, beautiful smile touching his lips. I was a prisoner of my own pride, and you are the only one who holds the key." He leaned forward, his lips brushing the scarred knuckles of her hand. The kiss was brief, but it sent a jolt of lightning through her. Just as she began to reach for him, a horseman broke through the line. It was Sealers, his face bloodied. "Your Grace, the French envoys have arrived at the border. They aren't here for a princess," he gasped, clutching a black-tipped arrow. "They've come to finish what the revolution started. They know who the boy is." Isolde looked from the Duke in the mud to the dark horizon. To save the heir, they had revealed a secret that had brought 2 kingdoms to their doorstep. Will Isolde accept the Duke's surrender, or will she sacrifice their love to lead an army against her own blood? The black-tipped arrow hissed through the air, thudding into the carriage door inches from Valerian's head. "To the horses," he roared, but Isolde didn't move. She stood over him in the mud, her hand gripping the locket that proved she was a princess. In that moment, the stable Duchess died and a sovereign was born. "Sealers, take the boy," she commanded, her voice ringing with a steel that silenced even the approaching French cavalry. "Valerian, get up. If we are to face a kingdom, we do it standing." 3 months later, the doors of the Nightmoor ballroom swung open with a resonance that shook the very foundations of the ton. This was the night of the Restoration Ball, the event that would either cement their legend or see them led to the gallows. The silence was absolute as Isolde Marouin stepped into the light. Gone were the muck-stained rags and the haunting stoicism of the stables. She wore a gown of shimmering emerald silk, so vibrant it seemed woven from the northern lights, cinched at the waist by a belt of pure gold. Around her neck sat the Star of the North diamond, but it was the crown of braided dark hair and her steady, piercing gaze that truly commanded the room. Beside her walked Valerian, no longer the brooding executioner, but a man transformed by a love he had almost murdered. On his broad shoulder sat Cassiel. The boy was dressed in a miniature velvet coat of Nightmoor purple, his silver-flecked birthmark gleaming under the chandeliers. He wasn't a hidden secret anymore, he was the future. Lady Alara, watching from the periphery in a plain grey dress, her punishment being the very invisibility Isolde once suffered, dropped her fan in shock. The Prime Minister bowed so low his nose nearly touched his buckskin breeches. The King's Guard, once her hunters, now stood as her honor guard. Valerian stopped at the center of the floor, turning Isolde to face him. The romantic tension was a living thing, a heat that radiated between them, drawing every eye in the room. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You look like a queen, Isolde, but you feel like my wife." "And you," she whispered, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the frantic beat of a heart that was entirely hers, "look like a man who is very lucky I have a short memory for grudges." He laughed, a rich, joyful sound, and led her into the first dance. As they spun, the emerald silk flaring like a dragon's wing, Valerian leaned down for a kiss that wasn't a performance. It was a seal of the truth they had fought for in the dark. But as the dance ended, a footman approached with a silver tray. On it was a single, blood-red rose and a note written in a hand that made Isolde's blood turn to ice. It read, "The stables were only the beginning. The French throne does not forget its debts." Isolde looked at Valerian, her hand tightening on the royal purple silk of Cassiel's coat. The transformation was complete, but the war for their family had only just shifted to a grander stage. Should Isolde have forgiven the Duke so easily after years of banishment, or is their love a truth worth fighting for? Tell us in the comments.